right, so we're going to get on to feeding now, and we're going to talk about the different sensory personalities and feeding, because the way that you wean your baby is very different according to their sensory personality. Your settled babies are generally great feeders, okay? Your social butterfly, they like really strong tastes. They like lots of different flavor. They like lots of different texture, and they can be quite distractible. And we're going to look into these in all more detail. Your slow to warm up often presents with breastfeeding challenges because they're not too sure about that breast thing, because there's a lot going on when you're breastfeeding and when you're being breastfed. There's a lot of sensory information going on. We're going to talk about that now. But once they settle into a certain type of feeding, they get really stuck there. They love it to be just like that. And as toddlers, their favorite word at mealtime is no, and to close their lips, because anything that's new, they don't want to engage with. And then finally, your sensitive baby, they often have breastfeeding challenges because they, again, are very sensitive, like your slow to warm up. They don't like bottle transitions, and they really do have a tricky time moving on to solids. So your sensitive baby is going to give you a tough time with meal times. All right, so let's have a look at what we can do about each of these. So let's start with your settled baby. I mentioned that they settle into a feeding routine really easily, and they tend to be very easy feeders. So they settle into a feeding routine. They don't mind the breast, they don't mind the bottle, they don't mind moving on to solids, and they're quite gregarious with what they'll try. A couple of things about them. As a newborn, they can be a little bit choky at times, especially if you've got a fast flow, and that's because they're quite laid back, and so, you know, kind of just taking in the sensory input that requires what we call the suck, swallow, breathe. So the suck, swallow, breathe is what you have to do in order to breastfeed. You've got to suck, you've got to swallow, and you still got to take a breath. And they battle with that kind of feedback from their body, because remember that they have a very high threshold, so they're not getting all the feedback, and so they tend to be a little bit more choky. So a nice solution for that, if you've got a choky baby and you are breastfeeding, just lie on your side and let them feed next to you if they are a settled baby. Sometimes these babies have a slightly low appetite, and that's because one of our senses, you'll remember, is interoception, which is getting those signals from within us. And so these little ones don't get all the signals from within them, so they don't actually perceive hunger, and that's why they sleep through so well at night. So they often have a slightly low appetite. But once they're going, once you've got them into a meal, they can tend to overeat. And the reason for that is that they're, again, not getting the interoception. They're not getting all those signals from inside to say that I'm full. And so for your toddler who tends to just keep going and keep going and keep going, it's worth actually teaching them words like, are you full? Do you feel full now? Because those type of words will help them to understand that actually they are starting to feel full. And that's what that signal means. So they start to feel the signals based on the words that you say. So how do you introduce solids to these babies? Because breastfeeding and bottle feeding is going to be straightforward. Well, with them, you want to have a rapid introduction of new flavors and textures. So you can jump right in. And that's one of the things we do in the Weaning Sense book. We go very, very quickly through all the different flavors and textures, because these little ones are going to really engage beautifully with all the new flavors. They tend to readily engage with new experience without resistance, and you can actually use meal times to spice up their life, and you can even start to turn them into a little bit of a social butterfly, because they take in, as they take in new flavors and tastes, it increases their arousal levels, so they become more animated. So meal times can be lots of fun with these little ones. What about your social butterfly? Well, of course, just like everything else in life, bland and repetitive is boring. So one of the things that often happens with these little ones is that you start them on solids. They start really, really easily on solids. And then after a week, they're sick of it. And when you look at it, it's because you've introduced something that's very bland and you've stayed with it for too long. So they don't want butternut for 3 weeks. They don't want rice cereal for 3 weeks. They want lots and lots of interesting things. As breastfeeders, they tend to be great breastfeeders until about 4 months, when they become distractible. And I'm sure many of you have had a baby at your breast and they're busy sucking away and they're turning their head away to look over their shoulder at somebody, tugging at your nipple, and they often are your social butterflies because they really are interested in what's going on in the world, and feeding is quite boring, especially if you're staring at somebody's chest at that close proximity. Like, it's boring. So they keep wanting to pull off and see what else is going on. So they can become tricky at about 4 months in terms of breastfeeding. And so one of my suggestions for that is to actually feed in the dark or feed in a very quiet space, because if there's anything going on in the environment, and I can remember very clearly with my firstborn, who was a social butterfly, feeding him at a wedding at 4 months old, and until then he'd been an easy feeder, and suddenly it was impossible. I couldn't feed him because he kept wanting to watch what was going on. So for them, you want to feed them in a quiet space so they're not too distractible. One of the things with social butterflies is that once they start with solids, they go off milk very quickly. And that's because milk is boring. It always tastes the same. The temperature is always the same. And it just, doesn't liven up life. Whereas solids are new colors, new flavors, new textures, and so they tend to drop their milk very quickly once they're in solids. And one of my pieces of advice for that is to just always remember that milk is your priority until 6 months. So always make sure that you let your little one fill up on milk and have solids afterwards, as an experiment rather than being the big focus until they're 6 months old. From 6 months onwards, the balance shifts towards solids, and then it doesn't matter if they go off milk. And they do actually tend to go off milk very quickly after 6 months. They just wean themselves down. So a couple of things with them, if you're watching your baby's signals in terms of them when they want to wean, you could start to think that a social butterfly wants to wean at like 3 months, go into solids at 3 months because they're interested in your food and they're getting bored of milk, and you think, I must move them onto solids. But just remember, we don't want to wean our babies too early, and 3 months would certainly be too early. So wait until your baby is a little bit older before you rush in with solids, okay? Another thing is really do introduce foods at a rapid rate and have a very varied diet with lots of flavors and textures and colors. Another thing is to really allow them to use the mealtime experience to actually experiment with all their different senses. They love to put their hands in the mess, to smear it on their face, to spit it out, to smell it, to look at the colors, to mix the colors together. And so you have to be quite kind of resilient as a mom. So all our 8-time type moms and dads, you need to suspend that at the kitchen door when you go and feed a social butterfly, because it's going to be messy. You need to actually ignore the mess because that's just part of the process. Another thing that works very well with them is modified baby-led weaning from 6 months old. So baby-led weaning, you'll probably know, is where babies actually feed themselves whole steamed foods. I don't believe in strict baby-led weaning because I think that it delays solids a little bit too late for their manual dexterity. But I do think that once they hit 6-7 months, it's really awesome if they've got the experience of whole steamed food as well as the bowl of mush that you've got in front of them. If you've got a toddler who'll only sit down for 2 minutes, which is very common with social butterflies, they'll sit down, quickly eat a little bit, and then they want to go. And that's because meal times can actually be boring if you want to just be on the go and if something else is interesting in the environment. So there you're going to need to use distraction with your toddlers. So toddlers need healthy food. They need food that has a lot of variety, but they also sometimes need a bit of distraction. And one of the things that I love to use is one of those spaghetti, or not spaghetti, herb jars with all the holes in the top, and take hard spaghetti and let them post them through it as soon as they've got that sort of manual dexterity. And it just helps to keep them distracted. Or funky placemats or plastic books that you can read together. Use distraction with your toddler. And then when your toddler becomes a little older, they're actually going to eat best when they're in a social situation. So have the cousins over, have friends over, or just let them eat at the family table with you and your partner, because that's really great for them. So what about your slow to warm up? So your slow to warm up baby resists changes. So they resist milk changes. They don't like going from breastfeeding to bottle feeding. They like to stick to one type of feeding. So once they're on once they're on breastfeed, they want to stay on breastfeed. If you need to move them onto a bottle, they're going to resist that nipple. Because why? There's a change. They don't like change. Now, that's very important for those of you moms and dads, or particularly moms. Let me talk to moms for this one, who are going back to work and you're breastfeeding or slow to warm up. You are going to need to introduce bottles before you go back to work. And it is worth doing that earlier than later. Unlike the settled baby, who you don't need to introduce bottles early to because they're going to switch anyway. They don't mind what they have. Your slow to warm up gets stuck on a certain nipple type, and it can be your breast nipple. And then they don't want to move on to other things. So just make sure that's at the back of your mind. Remember also, your slow to warm up babies do not like surprises and too much variety. So they can actually present as fussy toddlers. So these little ones, if there's a lump of hard potato in mashed potato, they really won't like it. Or if there's a pea inside the mashed carrot, a whole pea in the mashed carrot, that's a different texture. They don't love it. Now, right, going back to our slow to warm up bubba. So just a couple of things. First of all, they often are very resistant to breastfeeding in the early days, because remember that their sensory space is that they become overstimulated. Breastfeeding is very sensory laden. You smell, there's this touch of feel of your clothes, of your body, your sounds, and they often take a bit of time to establish breastfeeding. But once they're on the breast, they tend to be very good breastfeeders. The one challenge is you do need to introduce bottles and nipples if you are going to be going back to work. That is important. Another very important thing with these little ones is to really avoid stage 1 jarred smooth baby food. So I'm not a fan of jarred baby foods because I think that they classically are too smooth. I prefer homemade food, and for those of you who know that we have a Weaning Sense feeding range which is available in Checkers, and it's also available on through YouCook. Now those foods, we made them very specifically with lots and lots of texture because we don't want little ones to get stuck on smooth jarred baby food, and your slow to warm up really do get stuck. If you've given them something that's too smooth, they'll never go to lumps. Remember also that sometimes they can need like 14 exposures before they can actually engage with something. So they tend to need a lot of exposure before they think something's safe. Because remember, anything that's new is considered dangerous until it's proven safe. So they need a lot of exposures. Also, don't have surprises in food. You can also keep the food separate. So keep your mashed carrots together, keep your rice in a pile so they can actually see what they're eating and that the food actually looks like the texture that it's going to be. And then very importantly, the last point on this slide is please remember that it's not supposed to be a war zone. Your slow to warm up baby tends to like control. They tend to like to have the final say. And if you are a parent who likes to have the final say as well, you can end up clashing heads. And meal times is the one place you don't want to have it. So please read Weaning Sense, understand how to honor your baby at meal times. And then finally, your sensitive baby. It can be very tricky to be feeding a sensitive baby. It can be a minefield. They tend to be picky eaters. They often get stuck on whites, and that's white breads, pasta, all of fried foods. They tend to get stuck there. So just remember with your sensitive baby that you need to just be patient with them. They also need these 14 exposures before they accept things. And remember, when things are getting really tough for you and your sensitive baby, it isn't your fault. It's got to do with their sensory personality. And I think that knowing that this is more about them than it is about you is often quite liberating. Don't fight them at meal times, and don't be slave to a scale. It's very easy with our sensitive babies who are picky eaters to get worried about their weight gain and be watching their weight gain all the time. But if your baby is sleeping okay and they're thriving, then you don't have to be slave to the scale. All right, and then with them you want to go with slightly blander flavors. They tend to like their blander flavors. And another thing you need to know with them is that there's a big difference between a gag and a choke. So a gag is when there's a bit that goes towards the back of their mouth, and because they're more sensitive, they kind of do a gag, whereas a choke is when it's something in their airways. So if there's a gag, don't worry about it, don't react to it. If there's a choke, obviously you do want to.